Hello everyone, welcome to Asura Psych, and a question I get a lot on this channel is people asking, hey Asura, are you ever going to talk about the shadow functions or the bottom four functions in a function stack that aren't typically used by a specific personality type? And what I often tell people when they ask me this question is that I don't use an 8-function model because I follow a more classical Jungian approach. And today in this video, I want to show you the conceptual model that I use for a 4-function model, essentially how I understand the cognitive functions to play out and the reasons I don't personally use an 8-function model. Let's get into it. So the main reason that I use a 4-function model instead of an 8-function model is because Carl Jung proposed the idea that there were 4 cognitive functions, not 8. But these 4 cognitive functions existed in 2 different attitudes, which creates 8 versions of these 4 cognitive functions. The difference, though, is that inherently they aren't different things. Introverted feeling and extroverted feeling are both the feeling function. They are not 2 separate entities. Extroverted thinking and introverted thinking are both thinking. So a lot of people tend to think that they're 2 entirely different and separate entities, when in reality they are the same thing, but they exist on the opposite end of a spectrum of introversion and extroversion, which changes how they display and how they respond to certain situations. The reason it's so critically important to understand this specific thing when talking about typology and functions is because we need to understand the pull that each function has towards introversion and extroversion, which is to say how introverted and how extroverted each specific function is, because again, they're not 2 separate entities that exist separately from one another. So I'm going to pull up a picture here in a minute, and I want to look at it and kind of explain why it's important and why Jung proposed the functions in this way. So this is Jung's illustration of the psyche, specifically in regards to the functions. You'll notice that this is going to be a thinking type because the top half of the circle is thinking and the bottom half is feeling. But the interesting thing that you'll note is that on the side you can see there are intuition and sensing, and they exist both within and outside of the conscious and unconscious side of the psyche, the top half being consciousness, the bottom half being unconsciousness. And this is because Jung believed that the 2 center functions were almost both auxiliary functions and that one would only have a slight preference over the other. These 2 center functions exist in a state of being both semi-conscious and semi-unconscious. Therefore, they exist in slightly introverted and slightly extroverted attitudes. The difference here, though, between what people usually propose and what is proposed in Jung's more classical works is that the center 2 functions don't exist entirely within one specific attitude, like you would see with the dominant function. Say, for example, we're looking at a thinking dominant type, a ENTJ, for example. Extroverted thinking is going to exist entirely in the extroverted attitude, where you're not going to see this is going to be the case with introverted intuition, the secondary function. Introverted intuition has a relative balance with the next function, extroverted sensing, and therefore does not exist entirely in the realm of introversion, like you're going to see with the dominant and repressed functions that exist entirely within their attitude. So this next image I'm going to show you is my personal conceptual illustration of this idea, which is to say that this is how I perceive Jung to have explained this idea and why I think this is important when looking at things from a 4-function model. Now you'll see in this image here that I have an example type INTJ. There's a pull towards introversion being towards the top of the picture and extroversion being on the bottom. Now, if you look at the intuition and sensing functions, you can see that intuition exists entirely in the realm of introversion. It does not cross the line towards extroversion. Sensing, on the other hand, exists entirely within the realm of extroversion and does not cross into the realm of introversion. But if you look at the thinking and feeling functions, the 2 auxiliary or center functions within the type, you can see that there's a strong preference towards one side of that spectrum, but there is a slight crossover into the other side. You can also see this with the feeling function, so thinking and feeling both have a slight preference for one of the attitudes. The difference here, though, is that we're going to see that because these functions only have a slight preference, they're still going to be able to express some of the traits of the function in the opposite attitude, which is to say that an introverted feeling type like the INTJ who has tertiary introverted feeling might be able to express slight expressions of extroverted feeling, or on the other hand with the thinking function, introverted thinking. These expressions are going to have to be learned and developed with age and time, but because the pull towards one conscious or unconscious side of the psyche is not so inherently strong within them, they could potentially develop slight traits of these functions. So how does all of this differ from an 8-function model? Well, I think the primary difference is that it's important to conceptualize them as a 4-function model instead of an 8-function model because there are 4 distinct functions and not 8 ones that are entirely different from each other. And when you view these 4 functions as being on a spectrum between introversion and extroversion, then you can really see where the differences in personality are going to be, specifically within those center 2 functions that have that relative balance and could theoretically show signs of being in the opposite attitude. This is also important, though, when you look at the dominant and repressed functions that exist entirely within the conscious or unconscious attitude, because these functions are not going to express the traits of the opposite attitude function version of it. So, for example, an INTJ is not likely going to express very much extroverted intuition, and they're likely not going to express much introverted sensing either. These are not things that are going to be inherently valuable or noticed by them. So I want to clarify this point just to make sure that this conceptual understanding is getting across as I think it should. I wouldn't say, for example, that an INTJ has both introverted and extroverted feeling. I would say that the feeling function exists with a pull towards the introverted attitude that is not so all-consuming like the dominant introverted intuition function, which is to say that this pull towards introversion is strong, but not entirely so much that it's going to completely remove it from the realm of extroversion. Therefore, the feeling function exists in a more relatively balanced state with a larger pull towards the introverted side of that function. And you can see the opposite of this when we look at extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking is going to be pulled toward the realm of extroversion, but not so much so that it's going to completely ignore the introverted side of that function. And again, this differs when we look at the dominant and repressed functions that exist entirely within one attitude. Another way that this model differs from most 8-function models is that we wouldn't say, for example, that an INTJ is going to have any form of repressed or struggling introverted sensing. We would say that they simply don't have introverted sensing. It's not a way in which they view the world or which they value the world. Take, for example, the concept of object sentimentality, which is usually associated with introverted sensing. Introverted intuitive dominant or repressed types are not likely going to show many strong signs of object sentimentality because the introverted sensing function is not part of the psyche in any meaningful way. It is not repressed and therefore is not a problem area. It's not something that they're struggling to deal with. It's simply something they don't value and they don't perceive in the world. Now, in this specific model, we might say that certain types don't have certain functions. So, for example, the INTJ wouldn't have extroverted intuition or introverted sensing. But that also means that those specific functions are going to interact with people of that type in a more or less meaningful way. Say, for example, we look at extroverted intuition and compare it to the INTJ, who has dominant introverted intuition. The INTJ doesn't have extroverted intuition, but they're likely to have some sort of respect for it because they themselves are intuitive, and therefore they enjoy the exploration of ideas. The difference, though, is that the INTJ wants to narrow down concepts and ideas because they are very personal to them. And extroverted intuition, on the other hand, is the opposite side of that spectrum and wants to make the ideas non-personable. They want to explore them in their fullest. They want to make sure that they can explore every connection between things that they can find. Now, this is going to be annoying to an INTJ, but it could also be something that they would enjoy interacting with someone who isn't themselves, and as long as it's not going to be reflective on their personal goals in their life. Now, when we look at introverted sensing, which is reflective of the INTJ's repressed extroverted sensing, the INTJ isn't going to have introverted sensing, but it's also not going to be something that's even remotely interesting to them because it's not even reflective of their dominant introverted intuition. So we often find with this specific function in types, the ones that they don't have that are reflective of their 4th function, that this is going to be something that they devalue and are disinterested in. Which is to say that they're not even going to want to interact with this, and they're not even going to realize that they don't want to interact with this. It's just going to be something that they don't even really think about or employ in their lives in any meaningful way because it's not part of their psyche in any meaningful way. If we again go back to the idea of object sentimentality, which is often associated with introverted sensing, you're going to find that NI dominant types don't really tend to have this trait. And this is because they don't tend to view the world of sensing in a subjective way, because they view the world of intuition in a subjective way, and they view the world of sensing in a completely objective way because it exists entirely in the extroverted attitude. Alright everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on why I personally use a 4-function model and why I tend to stick more to Jung's classical teachings compared to some of the more newer models. And it's because I believe that Jung had a really deep understanding of this concept that he was proposing of personality type and typology. And I think that this is glossed over by many more people in the modern typology community who really don't even understand a lot more of the basics that Jung was trying to teach, let alone the more deeper understandings. And that's what I've been trying to do over the past couple months, is really deep dive into the true understanding that Jung had of personality and personality typology. I would like to remind everybody that I do have personality typing sessions available at my website, asurapsych.com, if you're interested in working with me to find out what your personality type is and what that means for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This has been Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.